And now we'll get down to the fun part of the evening. Randy Zahn is the great-grandson of Albert Zahn, who has become a very well-known folk artist. He lived in Bailey's Harbor, first on a farm, later in that quaint little blue and white house that people are always asking, what is that house? And we are going to know everything about that house, I think, by the time we're done tonight. Randy has made a real study of his great-grandfather's work. He himself has embarked on a little wood carving career? Hobby, I thought. Hobby, and some of his pieces are at the end of this table here. And I think he does that sort of as an homage to his great-grandfather. He's going to share Albert's story of his evolution as a folk artist, his creation of an art environment at Birds Park, and how the recognition of his talent and achievements developed. And I can see that there certainly is recognition as I look over this nice large crowd we have tonight. So, Randy, it's all yours.
I'd like to thank everybody for coming tonight. And I'd like to share Albert's story with you. Albert August Zahn was born February 1st, 1864 in Niederwitz, Germany. Niederwitz is part of the province of Pomerania, just south of the Baltic Sea. And now it's part of present-day Poland. He immigrated to America in 1879 at the age of, I have 15. I've read so many articles, so many different ages, I'm not sure which it is. And he immigrated with his parents, Carl and Ernestina, and with a brother and a half-sister. Albert had at least one more brother that remained in Germany. And just a little side story, Albert's brother's son that immigrated to the United States in the early 1900s, his name was August. And in Germany, he learned the trade of being a blacksmith, and he was a Bailey's Harbor blacksmith. And my great-grandfather, when he immigrated to the United States, he stayed with my great-grandfather, which would have been his Uncle Albert, and around Bailey's Harbor, he's just known as a blacksmith. Albert, with the help of his Uncle Albert, August, with the help of his Uncle Albert, and Albert Jr. built a half-timber and stone block building, and August and his family lived in the house, and the blacksmith shop was next door. Now it's the Blacksmith Inn. So I know there's a lot of people that are wondering what the connection was. The blacksmith was the woodcarver's nephew. And the rest of the family sailed from Bremen, Germany on a ship called the Frankfurt. When the ship stopped, the family arrived at the port of Baltimore in Maryland. After the ship docked, Albert's brother departed from the rest of the family and continued further out west. The remainder of the family settled in Forestville because they already had family there. The reason they left Germany, this is in Holand's Door County book too. It said the life left behind in Germany was much the same as slaves that worked for the large estate owners. All the men in Pomeranian area were required by the government to serve in the military. Due to the military requirement, there were very few horses left for the farming. And with the lack of horses, they said it was a common occurrence to see two women and a dog hitched to a plow with another woman holding the handles plowing their field. And when Albert worked in Forestville, he worked with They didn't call it a well driller, it was called a well digger. I don't have no idea what that was about. But then they came up and worked in the Bailey's Harbor area. And this is the reason he came to Bailey's Harbor. The half-sister stayed in Forestville, and she married a man with the last name of Hafman, and she spent the rest of her life there. And I know I still have family there, but I don't really know who they are. In October 1883, Carl, which would have been Albert's father, purchased 80 acres in Bailey's Harbor. And here is the deed. And the 80 acres were purchased from somebody by the name of William Dorn and August Hemphill for $150. And there were 3 payments made, $50 payment at the time of sale. Later on, another payment of $50 with $7 interest, and the last payment of $50 with $3.50 interest. And if this farm had been cleared, or I have no idea. I'm sure there still would have been a lot to do on it. If all of Bailey's Harbor had been logged over, so that there were stumps and rocks, and a lot of them would have had a cabin on. Whether this had a cabin on or the first house is the one that he built or not, I have no idea about that either. Anyway, Carl and his wife Ernestina named their farm the Silver Dew, and the original homestead is located now on what's East Meadow Road, about 5 miles north of Bailey's Harbor. Then later on, Albert purchased another 20 acres. That would have been in 1887, and I just remember stories about how there were logs on there yet, and they chained them together and burned them in order to clear the land so they could farm it. And then later on, he purchased another 80 acres, I think a 40, and later on another 40, but the first 40 that he purchased would have been mostly swamp, and there was a hill of gravel in the swamp. So in order for him to farm on it, he dug a ditch around 2 sides of it by hand to drain it. And this wasn't on any of our property, but I do remember when I was a kid, there was 40 acres that somebody did begin to clear, and the stumps were still in the field, and you could see where whoever had cleared it had chopped at the stumps, and they plowed around the stumps in order to raise a crop. And Albert constructed a large fieldstone barn. I still think it's one of the larger barns in the area. I went and measured it. It's about 40 by 80. And when you look inside the barn, you find timbers with burn marks on. I know there were a lot of down logs and the fires that went through, and when they built their buildings, they just chopped around, and they didn't care if it was burned or not. They just chopped the flat side. And one of the things he did that is really unusual, instead of just putting pine boards on, the swamp must have been full of black ash. So he cut all this black ash, had somebody plane it in wainscoting. The whole barn had been covered with wainscoting. The north end still had the wainscoting on yet. The rest had been their pine boards put on later on. At some point in time, there was a windmill up on top of the barn roof, and they used it for some of their chores, and I was told they used it for milling wheat and the flour, and even sawing wood. And this would have been Albert Sr.'s son. When Albert Jr. owned the farm, there was a windstorm. Couldn't get the windmill to disengage, so he had to crawl up on the barn to disengage the windmill, and while he was up there, he hurt his shoulder. And I guess it took a long time mending. He spent time in bed, and as soon as he was well enough, that was the end of the windmill. The windmill came down. And Albert Sr. had his little corner in the barn. They had a workbench. And in the wall one of the masonry walls, there's handprints, more than one, there's one of them. And I remember being little kids, me and my cousins, going to that corner of the barn, fitting our hands in those handprints, trying to decide which one of the great uncles possibly had made them. There were several other buildings on the property too. Well, there was a long, narrow building. I was wondering maybe this possibly even before the barn had been built. One corner of it had a big door big enough in the back of it for the pigs to go in and out. And on the end there was a real small door, and that's where the chickens went in and out. And then on the other end there was a machine shed. As long as I could remember, the whole building was just used as a machine shed. And the house they built was a half-timber house. It was 2 stories, so it was probably pretty large for, the late 1800s. Everybody else was still living in log cabins. And they didn't have storm windows, so they had shutters. The shutters opened and closed on a track. And as you can see over the front door, he had the leaping deer, and over the top there was the flying eagle even then. And in upstairs there was a room where you see the little bump out. And I was told that was referred to as the organ room because Albert played a pump organ. He just played by ear, but he had his pump organ up there. And Albert used his woodworking talents to build the things his family needed. The dining room table, the dining room chairs, and there were a cupboard, and he even made some of his own tools. I know my father talked about how there were old wood block planes around, and they're things that he had made. One particular block plane was made with a tine out of a pitchfork. And the china cupboard I have, rather than hinges, the doors open and close just on a wooden peg. So it had to be perfect in order for those doors to open. And I do have an armoire and a rocking chair and several plant stands and the desk. And these items didn't have any, this furniture didn't have any carvings on yet. It was just utilitarian. But every piece, for where he came up with it, but for some reason, a lot of it was made out of black ash, a little bit of pine, and they all had just a little bit of black walnut for a little trim somewhere. And he, rather than just a barbed wire fence, he constructed fieldstone pillars on 2 sides of the yards, and of course barbed wire in between to keep the cows out of the yard instead of keeping the cows in. And I remember one story somebody had told me about people traveling all the way to the end of the dirt road just to photograph that house. And a picture turned up on the Wisconsin Historical Society collection. The title for this picture was, the picture is of the photographer's son, Ferdinand Holtz. He's winding film in his camera in front of the Albert Zahn house. And some of these pillars are still standing, not too many, but they're over 100 years old. And Albert Sr. married Louise Strag, May 15th, 1891. It was at the Christ Lutheran Church, and that's kind of the corner of 57 and Q, and it's on the hill. And Albert, I guess, helped build the church, and when he was a member there, he played the pump organ. I don't imagine they played a lot of songs because he only could play the pump organ by ear, but it was all the important ones. And Louise was much younger than Albert, but Albert already owned his own farm, so who better to take care of your daughter than a man that already owned his own farm? And the oldest son had been Albert Jr. He stayed in Door County. He was a farmer. And then there was a daughter, Louise. She moved to Chicago and married a Dombrowski. And another, Anna Warren. And Marie Baker. Louise was born in 1894, Anna, 1896, Marie Baker, 1898, and William. Some of you may remember Uncle Bill. he was the manager of the Kangaroo Lake Orchards, and later on, he lived in Jacksonport. And Teddy, he was born 1902, and Amanda Chapman, 1906, and Elmer, 1910, and he managed Gordon Orchards. And Evelyn Langer was the youngest, and Evelyn with her husband owned Cedar Ridge Greenhouse, and when you went past their garden, there never was a weed in it. And you still go past it today during the summer. There's some lupines that have basically gone wild, still blooming during the summer. And one of the first things that a farm would have needed was a team of horses. And after I looked through the first couple of tax receipts, and one of the 40s were missing, and I never understood what happened. And I asked my father, and he says, I don't know. He said, all I know is there was a story where the family lost a piece of property in a horse deal. And I was reading the story in Holland's History of Door County. So this kind of explained what may have happened. And the story took place in the 1880s, and it revolved around Henry Hamel and Leopold Jacobs and the horse deals they made with the farmers. The two men had horses to sell, and many of the farmers were in dire need of them. So the horses were sold at what was a reasonable price, and they secured it with a mortgage against their real estate. And after the farmers purchased the animals, it didn't take long, there'd be some sort of defect in either one or both of the animals. And it's later on, not long after that, the men would be, these two guys would be in town again, selling horses again, and they would talk to the farmer and say, oh, you know, you've had really bad luck. I've got another team of horses that's better than the last one, and let's make another deal. But the deal always ended up with costing the farmer more money. And so the farmer would realize that the notes and loans that they had made for what would ended up being a third-rate team of horses costed them anywhere from $1,000 to $1,500, and it got to the point where they couldn't pay, and due to the large amount of money, many of the farmers could not pay off their notes and ended up losing their land or other items of value. And this was in Holland's book. It said in the 1890, there was about 13 farms deserted in Bailey's Harbor as a result of the deal that the farmers made with these two men. And then as I was going through some of the old receipts, what should show up, but a bill of sale, 1884, one black mare, 7 years old, one black horse, 15 years old, and there was a set of harnesses that went with it, and Albert had purchased them for $275. And one of the names on the bill of sale, Henry Hamel. And there was a chattel mortgage against the farm on it. And he had 5 years. It was a 5-year loan at the rate of 4%. And then there were some other loans and things that I found. I found one in 1883. They had borrowed $30 from Jacob Brand, and he had 4 months to pay it back at 10% interest. And then there was another one I found, 1896. It was for $140 credit from the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company. And anyway, in order to have credit for this $140, he had to put up his team of horses and 6 cows. So I guess in 1896, my great-grandfather would have owned 6 cows, and there would have been other farm animals, and the chickens and the pigs and probably some sheep, but they were of no real value. And some of the other things that turned up in 1897, he bought a 4.5-foot mower, and it was purchased from McCormick Deering for $55. And here his pump organ showed up in 1900 from the J.C. Dana Agriculture Implement Company for $27.15. And in 1904, he bought a double disc drill, and that was purchased from Joseph Lemire. That would have been in Jacksonport for $34 with 7% interest. And here the windmill turned up. 1911, a windmill was purchased from the J.C. Dana Company for $25. And Albert was never a hunter. There was only one hunting story that was told to me when Albert was deer hunting. He found his target, shot his rifle, and his rifle had a name. The rifle would kick, so he called it Cowfoot. And after Albert shot the deer, he went over to it. The deer jumped up, Albert on his back. So Albert rode the deer till he cut the deer's throat. And when they dressed the deer out, the only bullet hole they could find went through the deer's ear. So that was kind of the end of his hunting. But I always kind of took this for granted, but he did some taxidermy too. He would, these are, like I said, these are 100 years old. He would stuff the heads, and the skulls were still in them. And he would just stretch the neck over a hollow cedar rail, and some of the deers had eyes, some of them didn't. And he'd stick some red material in the mouth that kind of resembled a tongue. And that was it. But he did do trapping, and I remember seeing a fur collar that belonged to his wife Louise, that he had trapped mink, and he had made the collar for her. And then there was another story about, since Albert didn't like to do the butchering, his father-in-law came over with the intention of butchering a sheep buck. As soon as the man arrived, Albert would disappear because he wanted no part of it. And the sheep had a different plan in mind. The sheep had chased the father-in-law up into the beams in the barn. And the only person that was around was Albert Jr. That would have been my grandfather, and he was still a young child. And he had to clip the sheep alongside the head and knock it out so his father-in-law could not come down from the beam. And then there was another story about great-grandma. It must have been through the summer, and it was dry. One day they looked out the window, and here there was a bear drinking out of the cattle's watering trough. The men weren't home, only Louise with the children. So Louise shot at the bear, and all she had was like a small handgun, and scared the bear away. It wouldn't have hurt the bear. And years later, I found this small handgun in the orchard, all rusty, buried in the dirt, and I saved it. I always like to think that was the gun that Louise shot at the bear with. And the older children, when they still lived on the homestead, they all would have went to the woodland school. And I was told on occasion that teachers were invited over for Sunday dinner. And one of the other stories was, this was told by my great-uncle Elmer, one of the sons. He would have been the youngest, so he was in school with his older siblings. And one day, his older brother had a falling out with the teacher. And I can still hear Uncle Elmer talking about the words that he used. My brother flopped the teacher. The hairpins flew. Elmer said he was terrified about what happened when he got home. And they got home, told the story. Albert Sr. said, "That's enough school for you." And that was the last day that Uncle Teddy went to school. And this is just kind of a little side thought, but deer hunting was always an important part of my family's history, even though Albert did not hunt. However, he was always happy when his sons hunted, though, because it meant he would get some venison. And whenever fall rolled around, there was always a fat pig on the farm so they could make their smoked sausage. And they would also can the meat. And this was a little later on, but every family gathering, there were always the hunting stories. And a lot of the stories were all the same, but Every year, the bucks got smarter and the bucks got bigger. And when I was growing up, visiting, one of the things we did, we'd always visit each other at Christmas time and see everybody's Christmas tree. This would have been Albert Jr. and Marie and me. It was Albert Jr.'s last Christmas. And Albert Sr. did carve angels. All of his kids had angels to put on their trees, and this would have been it. I always remember with the blue skirt and the pink blouse, and they would have hung on the trees. And with being a farmer, it was always important, and it was always a struggle to find enough feed for your cattle. So the Albert Sr. would go down to Mud Lake, into the swamp, and he'd cut marsh hay, stack it so the rain would run off, and then when the ground would freeze and fall, he would go back into the swamp and haul that hay out for the horses and the cows. And there's one story, this was in The Advocate, 1919, the 9th month, the 12th day, where there was a disagreement. Gus Miller of Liberty Grove was given $153 in damages by the jury in the case against Albert Zahn Jr. The case was for assault and battery in a fight that occurred in the town of Bailey's Harbor in May. It was the alleged defendant bit a piece of Gus' earlobe off. From what I understand, the fight was about where the cattle were allowed to graze. And Albert Sr. decided to sell his homestead to Albert Jr. After Albert Jr. came back from World War I. 1919, the 7th month, the 17th day, the Door County News. World War I, Albert Jr. left on August 14th, 1918, and he returned home from France the 7th month, the 17th day of 1919. And when Albert Sr. left Germany, came to the United States, one of the reasons were because of the military, so he didn't want any of his sons to have a birth certificate. So whether Albert Jr. was drafted or whether he went to the military on his own, I have no idea. And then shortly after Albert was back from the military, he married. And I found this wedding announcement in the Door County News, the 10th month, the 7th day, 1920. The marriage of Marie Pagel of Kohlberg and Albert Zahn Jr. of Bailey's Harbor. The wedding took place in the German Lutheran Church at 7 o'clock by Reverend Hinthel officiating. The wedding is a very pretty affair. The bride was dressed in a gown of white satin and Georgette crepe, with veil, and carried a shower bouquet of white roses in Lily of the Valley. She was attended by Miss Martha Pagel, her sister, as maid of honor, and Miss Amanda Zahn, sister of the groom, as bridesmaid. The groom was attended by Theodore Zahn as best man and William as groomsman. After the ceremony, the wedding party, consisting of relatives of the contracting parties, repaired to the home of the bride's parents, Mr. and Mrs. August Pagel, where a reception was held. The home was prettily decorated for the occasion, and a scrumptious dinner was served. The groom is the son of Mr. and Mrs. Albert Sr., Zahn Sr., Bailey's Harbor, and is the owner of a fine farm in that township where the newly married couple will make their future home. Their many friends joined in wishing them a long and prosperous wedding life. With the eldest son, Albert Jr., on the homestead with his wife, Marie, and children, Albert Sr. decided to move to town. By moving to town, he was in walking distance of the things they needed. Albert never had a driver's license, so being able to walk from place to place was very important. My father remembers the 3 generations living in the farmhouse together. His memory was of Louise sitting by their desk, making sure all the finances were in order. I still have the homemade desk. His half-timber farmhouse was beginning to sway in the wind. One of the stories about his house was that if you slept in the upstairs on a windy night, your bed might move through the night. When he built his next house, it would be built of concrete, and Bird's Park would last forever. There was no need for a very large house. I don't know where the plan came from. In a lot of ways, the house was similar to the farmhouse. Albert and Louise built the house themselves with the help of their children when they had time. They mixed all the concrete by hand, then poured it into the wood form of the house, and then placed vertical cedar rails in the walls to absorb moisture and keep the frost out of the walls. I think there was another reason it took less concrete. Albert had built all the windows and frames and stored them for the finished house. Albert Sr. moved into his new home in town in 1924 at the age of 60 years old. In 1926, Albert Sr. became a naturalized citizen. In his house in town, the first floor of the home had a kitchen on the south end, and on the north end there was a front and back bedroom. In the center there was a stairways. The second floor had a parlor on the south end. There was a large bedroom on the north end. There also was a hall through the middle with a front and back door. Under the front steps, there was another small room where Louise kept her canning and vegetables. Under the back steps, there was another small room with a hand-driven well with a small hand pump. They could pump their water without having to go outside, which is especially important during the winter months. The room on the top of the house was added later to gain access to the roof more easily. On top of this room, there was a wind generator mounted with a small gasoline engine used to charge up the batteries when there was no wind to create electricity and light their home. After retiring from the farm, Albert did woodworking jobs around town. One of his jobs was building the cottages at Gordon Lodge. Even though he did woodworking jobs around, he still had time to carve and spend time with the birds that always fascinated him. He raised small tame birds and built cages himself. When he had too many birds, he built more cages, gave them away to family and friends. When I was young, I remember seeing a cage that reminded me of a castle. Now that Albert had retired from the farm, he had more time to focus on his hobbies that he may not have previously had time for. He could spend his spare time carving something that he taught himself as a very young child, tending farm animals. He carved all the things that left an impression on his memory, such as the men and women with their old world looks. Others were the Hessian soldiers, ships, sea captains that brought him to the New World, lumberjacks, all the birds and animals that influenced his life. To make his carvings, he used wood that was cedar or sometimes pine. Albert would bring in pine stumps home for kindling to be used in the wood stove. If the stumps had straight grain in the wood, he would pick them up and start carving. To do his carvings, Albert used a pocket knife, handsaw, and hatchet to rough his carvings out. To make the legs on the carvings, wire was used and tin was used for the wings. The tin that was used was from empty tin cans found around the house. Albert did his carving with his wife Louise, helped by doing all the painting. Albert Sr. and his wife Louise also made small sachet pillows of fresh balsam needles that they sold. The sachets could be used in dresser drawers to keep them smelling fresh. Albert Zahn, who retired from farming in 1924 to follow the long urge to carve birds, and as a result found himself engaged in a lucrative business, added another important event to his life, Thursday, this week, when he and his missus celebrated their golden wedding anniversary. It wasn't going to be much of an affair, but when the children, all 9 of them, suddenly showed up, the outsiders having congregated secretly in Sturgeon Bay for a march on the couple. There really was bedlam. The outside men-in-laws couldn't come because of work. but the daughters and their families, and both sons and the one daughter in Door County came, bringing all 16 grandchildren. Mrs. Zahn was too modest to allow her picture to be taken, so we couldn't print just one of Mr. Zahn without her on this occasion. Lots had been taken of him with his birds, of course. And a significant part of Albert's work was inspired by his belief in eternal life. He was schooled for 8 years in Germany in a Lutheran school. He was a very religious man and could preach a sermon that was as good as any country minister. He spent many hours reading his Bible. And many of the carvings reflect his deep Lutheran belief in eternal life. He constructed bird stands with the birds and animals looking upward towards heaven. Sometimes the top of the bird stands had an angel. In addition, all the animals and birds looking up to the heavens. Some of the bird stands that had many figures on the stands, they called the family tree. Some of the birds were inspired by Bible stories that he had read. And many of the people over the years have tried to analyze Albert's bird carving and tried to figure out why they look the way they do. I believe he had an eye to make them into their simplest, most appealing form. He carved them in the easiest and simplest way possible. And now that he was in town, he also built, his furniture also had birds and animals and all sorts of things on them too, decorating them, and not just, there's a chair, and I think this table would have been his Bible box. The bottom would flip open, and that's where he stored his Bible, and that's where he'd have been sitting on a Sunday morning reading his Bible. And Albert was an isolated artist. His work did not follow any of the other rules that many artists followed. Over the years, he created so many pieces that he used them to decorate the inside and outside of his house. By decorating his home, he created his own environment, and he called it Bird's Park. Tourists would stop and ask to buy some of Albert's carvings. At first, he wasn't interested in selling them, but after some encouragement from his family, he began to sell the carvings. He started selling the small pieces for maybe 25 cents or 50 cents, and some of the larger pieces for $5. Today, I think some of the smallest birds would be going for $350. And there you can see all the things on the outside of his house. And there you can see sort of the peak again where the wind generator would have been. There's Albert and Louise with some happy customers. And Albert's pieces can be found in many private collections as well as some of the museums around the country. The museums that have collected include the Art Institute of Chicago, the Guggenheim Museum in New York, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. The John Michael Kohler Art Center in Sheboygan, which owns probably the largest collection of Albert's carvings. And the Kohler Art Center had a show that showcased his work in 2003. It was called I'll Fly Away. In that show, I know she was worried about how she was ever going to find enough pieces to do a show, but they ended up with 200 pieces. 200 pieces were reunited, and then they did a second show, and that was in 2007, and that was with many other artists, and that was included his work called Sublime Spaces and Visionary Worlds. And there's a few private collections. The Bradleys have a very nice collection, and they're kind enough to be here tonight. And they did a show at Peninsula School of Art and displayed their work. That was in 2001. And another collection would be the people that own Birds Park now, and the McCulloughs, and they have their pieces in Oregon. And there's another really nice picture of maybe my great-grandma and grandpa. And there you get a good look at some of the birds in the back, how he constructed them. And after Albert's wife Louise died in 1950, he then moved in with his youngest son Elmer. He would have liked to pass his carving skills to one of his family members, but nobody's interested. And without Louise to paint the birds, he lost interest too. He died in 1953 at the age of 89. Albert and Louise are buried in Bailey's Harbor Town Cemetery. He must have left a lasting impression on a lot of his family, because including me, there's grandkids and great-grandkids all carry Albert as a middle name. After Albert and Louise have both died, there's still people asking to buy his work, so they'd open the house and sell some of the carvings. And at the first show at the Kohler, I met a lady that had been buying Albert's work all along, and she'd be selling it in her gallery. And she came for her last visit and bought a whole bunch of pieces, and she ended up with more stuff than she could take home. And Albert's family volunteered to get him down to where they said they were needed to make an apple delivery to Chicago, in the Chicago area. So she was told she needed to be in her gallery early in the morning. She was there. She had the door unlocked. She looked down the street. She said, and there came her precious carving on top of the load of apples. And there were pieces that showed up in the Kohler, and she was showing me. She said, "Oh, I remember having this one selling, and I remember having that one and selling it." And I was always fascinated by my great-grandfather's carvings, and he died the year I was born, so we had a couple family pieces, and I knew that's all I would ever have. So if I wanted any more, I decided I had to teach myself how to carve in his style, so that's what I did. And most of the small pieces on the outside of Birds Park today are pieces that I carved for the McCulloughs. And the shapes are simple, and even though they're simple, they're very labor intense. And I have no idea how Albert ever carved all the pieces he did. And I'm surprised as many lasted as they did, because people bought them. They were lawn art. They were put in their gardens, on their lawns, and over the years they just disappeared. I remember being at somebody's house once and looking in the garden, seeing this, just something all rotted and thrown in the corner, and I looked closer, and it was one of Albert's deer. And if there's anybody at all that has one of Albert's pieces or think they have one of Albert's pieces, I'd be more than happy to look at it and verify it for them. And these are a few of my pieces.
Randy, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I grew up in Bailey's Harbor and have gone past Birds Park a million times. I went through grammar school and high school with Marv Langer, and it was like this last week I learned that he was Albert Zahn's great-grandson. So, you can be right in the middle of it and not know about it, but you did a remarkable job.
Thank you.
And I would just like to make a little announcement, and then if there are questions, I'm sure you'll be glad to answer them. We always pass the hat at our organizations, because that's one of the few ways we have of accumulating any money so that we can put on shows like this and keep the records that we're trying to keep. And we have 2 elegant hats that, Steve, if you, one is a sailor hat, and one is a couture hat. So if you would just put one at the back of each side of the auditorium. If you enjoyed the program tonight and would like us to continue doing these things, we'd appreciate it very much from you. So are there any questions for Randy?
Yes?
Wait, Ron.
Your great-grandfather, the
Um,
largest one.
As far as I know, it would be the eagles that you see on the top of the house. And there's also, you look through the pictures, there's one very, very tall group of people that, when you drive past Birds Park, you see these little stone gardens, and it would have been in the middle of the stone garden. It's how many people high, and you'd have to guess how tall the people are and give you an idea of how tall the carving was. And I'm sure after he had died that somebody bought it and probably disassembled the whole thing, and it's pieces sold here and there now.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
I remember growing up that there were lots and lots more items in front of the building and on the building. And then it seemed like there weren't so many. Was there any looting of that stuff?
After it changed hands, there were a lot of pieces stolen. Mr. McCullough even told me a story of how when he was a little kid, him and his parents were in the house eating breakfast or something or another, and they heard something outside, and here was some lady trying to pull something off the house. So there's
As recently as when the McCulloughs have had it?
no, when he was a little boy, his parents.
That's right, his mom
parents
had
owned
that.
it.
Yeah, that's right, I remember that.
And there's pieces that have shown up that I know were stolen off the house.
You do that, you're faster.
Let's get this gentleman right here.
The dogs are such wonderful creatures. Were there any stories? Were there family dogs? I mean, what was the appeal of the dogs? 'Cause they're
Yeah, there
wonderful.
was always a farm dog, and he had a dog when he was in town. There was one story about how on Halloween, the neighbor kids were all going to come and push his outhouse over, and I think maybe the dog's name might have been Queenie, went out and grabbed one of them by the pants leg and tore their pants leg.
The gentleman over here, who is over here? Somebody over here?
I just, did he sign all of his pieces? or-
None of his work is signed, none at all.
So it's just trying to identify his pattern
Yes.
or what he did. Interesting.
Let's get over here. Pass it right down.
I just wondered if you sell any of your pieces.
Oh, I've sold quite a few over the years.
Where?
Right now, they're at the Newport Gallery in Ellison Bay, and this is the last year that those ladies are going to have their gallery.
You could probably talk to him when the show is over.
Right over here.
I'm just curious, what does an original go for now? What are they worth?
Thousands and thousands of dollars. I think this would have been one of the first show at the Kohler. These 2 pieces are mine, the 2 bigger pieces. And, they had to have a price on them in order to insure them when they were at the Kohler. And like I said, this was the first show, and what was it, like, how many years ago? And they were worth about $15,000 a piece. Yeah, that's what I say, about 10 years ago.
I have one of his birds that's just stained, not painted. Was that typical?
At first, when the Kohler did the first show, they wouldn't believe that anything that just was varnished, that they weren't his. I said, oh, yeah. This is a piece my parents got for a wedding present. The angel is just varnished. And then a lot of them started turning up when they started collecting pieces.
What do you think, Randy, keeps they keep showing up. Why, because I know you've talked about that, the one show, there'll be this many, and then here come a whole lot more. What makes that happen?
All I can think is that he carved so many pieces that, and people must have enjoyed them enough that they saved them. Some of them put them on their lawn, and some of them,
Then when they hear they're worth $3,000, they dig them out.
yeah. then their kids and their grandchildren, oh, gee, I'm glad they saved that.
Because I know you've talked about how many more you've seen now than what.
Yeah, the one just a few weeks ago, I went to his house and he asked me if I would look at it, and it was a rooster with metal wings on. I've seen him in pictures. It was the first time I've seen a rooster with metal wings.
Randy, how do you think Albert Sr. felt about sending Albert Jr. going to World War I?
Well, like I said, he didn't even want his kids to have birth certificates because he didn't want them to go. So whether he was drafted or if Albert Jr. chose himself to go, I don't know.
When was it, Randy, that the McCulloughs bought the house?
Shortly after my great-grandfather died. He died in 1953.
Okay.
So within the, couple of years.
Okay. I remember.
I was about 10, I remember
Right,
that.
yeah. Anybody else?
You mentioned the name McCullough. There was a McCullough living in the house just south of your great-grandfather. Is that the same McCullough family?
I think that was his grandfather. I think that was Robert's grandfather.
One of your legal deeds has a signature McCullough on it.
Yeah, there must have been more McCulloughs around town at some point.
Wasn't that the neighbor that Albert had a fuss with about the boundary line? And
No, that would have been the Hayfords.
Okay.
That was Hayford property.
And while Hayford was alive, they moved the line back, but as soon as he died, Albert put it back where it was.
I think Robert moved it. Robert bought that piece of property with the house on, and he moved it back. So that was the first thing I did. I wanted that to go back. I didn't know there was an issue with that until Robert McCullough told me that.
Another question, Lauren?
That barn that was there where Fay Cole built that cement block house, there was a barn there, that belonged to your great-grandfather or
No.
the McCulloughs?
No, I probably went with the McCullough farm there.
Okay.
Right here.
Can you say what kind of wood he preferred to use?
Most of it was cedar, but like I said, when they'd bring those big old stumps home and they had that nice straight grain, and I'm sure that would have been pine from the virgin pine that would have been in Door County.
What kind of wood do you use?
Mostly cedar. Cedar out of the cedar swamp where I live.
Do you have all his wood carving tools, Randy?
Nothing.
Nothing. You don't know what happened to any of that?
He just used his pocket knife and his hand saw and his hatchet, so.
That was it? Amazing.
I think it's delightful that the McCulloughs took the time and energy and financial investment in that house to make it look as great as it looks now.
Yes, I
It really
appreciate
is
that they own the house.
It really is an added addition to all of our community and culture.
Because I'm sure if the McCulloughs didn't own it, it'd probably just be a memory by now.
Anybody else?
If Albert Sr. could see what's happening with all of his carvings now, what do you think he would think?
I don't know, because it was just a hobby. He never planned on it being,
What do you think we're crazy? Yeah, for the prices we pay.
probably.
To me, he sounds like he was such a humble man.
Where's Mary Ann? Right over here. Thank you.
Very good, Randy. Good.
Randy, I think it would be of interest to the people to know that Bob McCullough and his wife have willed the house to the John Michael Kohler Arts Center. It goes directly to them. They had asked me a few years ago when they were doing their will, where should it go? And I felt that the town of Bailey's Harbor couldn't possibly sustain the expense that would be endured in maintaining it. And so I recommended the John Michael Kohler Arts Center because they do have the financial ability to care for it for many years. And I know you feel that way too,
Yes, I
Randy.
agree.
And I also wanted to tell people that there still are small birds of Albert Zahn's work that are available in Chicago antique stores. I had been given a hint of where to look, and it's true, they are there. And I did buy some for Bob McCullough because he wanted them, and I did purchase them in Chicago. And all that you do is you say, I'm interested in folk art. And you don't say the name of the artist at all. You just want to see folk art that they have, and sure enough, it's still there. When you come in off the Kennedy Expressway in Chicago and you turn onto Ohio and head towards the lake, you're going to pass Wells and Clark and Dearborn. And there's some very old antique stores there who do have small amounts of Albert Zahn's work. It's not inexpensive, but if you can buy something for $300 that's worth $3,000, it's worth it. Thank you.
We do have a grandson here that would remember Albert. I don't know if he has anything to add. Any stories, Orville? None?